Welcome to this latest video in our training course, Opening Heaven's Door. Every so often now, we're going to be looking at something specific healing stories in the Gospels and be asking what can we learn about the way that we minister from these stories from looking at Jesus. I think we often take the view that Jesus kind of turned up, healed everybody, and that's the end of the story, and it should be that simple. It isn't actually that simple though, because if you look at the different ways he ministered in the different stories, different things come out. It strikes me that at one point Jesus sends the disciples off with the command, heal the sick. And as they walked away going to whichever village they were going to, they probably had a conversation a bit like this. Well, he said heal the sick. How do we do it? What do we do? And then go through a few options. In the end, I suppose, all they'd come up with is, well, all we can do is we do what we've seen him do. We act like he acted, and then we'll be all right. And that's what I want to be looking at in these videos. Just try and look at how did Jesus minister? What was he trying to bring about in that ministry? And what can we learn from that for ourselves? I want to begin by looking at one of, I think, the most well-known of the healing stories, and what is a many favourite for many people. It's actually two stories in one. It's the story of Jairus' daughter, who's interrupted by the woman who touches the cloak of Jesus. So this story can be found in Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered round him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please, come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live." And so Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed round him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher any more?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. And after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Actually, there's a number of things in that story that speak to us as prayer ministers. And the first thing is this: Jesus responds to need. I wonder if you look around your church or your community, there are probably some people that you think should receive ministry. You know things about them, or folk have said things about them. You know that they need ministry. Well, the attitude of Jesus seems to be, he didn't force ministry on anybody. He waited for them to ask. He responded to those who asked. See, in the story, Jesus gets out the boat, and we're told that a large crowd gathers around him. Now, I don't know how many are in a large crowd, but in any crowd, I guess there would have been a number of folk to whom he could have ministered. He could probably see the different conditions that are there in front of him. So what does he do? Does he try and assess who's in the greatest need? Or does he try and find out who'd been waiting there the longest, but they ought to be seen first? He didn't need to, actually. What we read is this, that Jairus breaks out from the crowd and comes to Jesus. And he is the one that Jesus went with. Now, we notice this story carrying on, this principle carrying on as the story unfolds, actually. Because as he's on his way to minister to this dying girl, another person stops. And in a sense asks, well, not so much asks, but interrupts him. She reaches out, she touches his cloak, she expresses her need in that way. And again, Jesus stops. He stops where he's going to give all his attention to this person who has brought their need to him. And what strikes me is this, that when people come up to ask for prayer in church, whether it's in a formal church setting or even just a casual conversation, we need to be attentive and to offer to minister to those who ask. It's not so easy sometimes, Sometimes your heart sinks sometimes when some people come up for prayer. Maybe they've been coming up every week for the past year or something like this. Or maybe their story is so horrendous you just don't know what to do or what to say to them. And it's quite natural we feel like that sometimes. But the heart of Jesus is different. The heart of Jesus is to be attentive to people's needs. And one more thing about the needs that came to Jesus, he didn't seem to prioritize needs. He didn't think, well, this is more important than that. In this story, we see two people he ministers to: a dying girl who's 12 years old and a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. Now, in anyone's book, a dying child has got to be top of the list of priorities. But on his way to minister to this dying child, he stops to care for this woman that's been bleeding for 12 years. And to be honest, another half an hour would not have made any difference to her. He could easily have told her to go and sit down or park her somewhere and come back to her later, but he doesn't. Because she stops him, he gives her the time. He gives her his time and his energy. Leaving the girl actually to get sicker and sicker to the point where she actually dies. Now, of course, he goes on and he raises her from the dead. But my observation is this, that sometimes people's needs might seem quite trivial to us. And we might think, well, that's not really something I ought to be praying about. There are other people with far greater needs than that. But I think what we need to learn is this: we respond to people's needs. I remember years ago, we were at a church at a healing service, and this guy wanted prayer, and it was so trivial what he wanted prayer for. What it was that he'd been doing some exercise and he hadn't stretched properly, and he found he was a bit stiff and he couldn't touch his toes. And inside I was thinking, that is so trivial. You'll get better from that. And I wondered, should I be praying for this? I did, because it's quite hard to say no to people. And then after that, I prayed for somebody else who did seem to have a much greater need. While I was talking to this other person, this other guy comes up and taps me on the shoulder, and he says, look at this. And he's straight down and puts his hands flat on the ground, which is quite impressive anyway. And then he gets up and he bursts into tears as it dawns on him that God loved him so much that that little thing mattered to God. And actually was quite a changing moment for him as the depth of God's love really struck him. And that reminded me, I think, not to judge a person by their need, because God can take that need and do something wonderful with it. The second thing this story tells me is this, that God used Jesus even when Jesus didn't know what was happening. You see, this woman creeps up behind Jesus, she touches his cloak, and Jesus senses power going out of him. Now, he hadn't planned to minister to her. He didn't seem to have a sense there was somebody there he ought to pray for. She reaches out and touches him, and he senses something happening. He had no idea who it was. He says he looked round the crowd to see who it was that had touched him. And what this says to me, I think, is that we're probably not very good judges of what happens through our ministry. You know, maybe people don't feed back what happens, or maybe we just don't hear about what happens when we pray for people. But despite that, God might still be at work through us. And so therefore, let's not get discouraged. Let's trust he is working through us. As well as that, I think, what this says is that God can work through us at any time. All Jesus was doing at this point was walking along the road, going to minister to somebody else. I don't know in what way he prepared himself for ministry, but he was actually just walking along the road when someone touches him and this power goes out of him. What it says to me is, let's approach every occasion of ministry as an occasion when God can do something wonderful through us. You might not think that you've prepared yourself enough. You might not feel particularly plugged into God. It doesn't matter. God can do amazing things through us simply by our being there and being there with another person. Third thing this story says to me is this, that Jesus was able to keep his vision on what God could do despite changing circumstances. Very often I think we start off in this ministry with great enthusiasm, but it doesn't take long sometimes for that enthusiasm to begin to wane. Maybe not many folk come up for prayer, or maybe we just don't hear about any results from the ministry that we're trying to practice. Or maybe the ministry doesn't go well and people seemingly, or even definitely, get worse. We have to make that choice, I think, not to be discouraged, because Jesus certainly did. At the beginning of the story, the girl is sick. By the time he reaches the house, the girl has died. It's a whole new thing. But Jesus doesn't stop and give up. He still has his vision. God can still do something wonderful, even though events have taken a real turn for the worse. We catch that when he says to Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. It's not over yet. I think as prayer ministers, we can get disheartened very, very quickly. And what the story tells me is this, there is always more that Jesus can do. If we're praying for somebody and it doesn't seem to be going well, is there something else that he's doing in their life? Maybe they don't feel any improvement in the particular area they sought prayer for, but is he pinpointing something else in their life that he wants to touch? Are they sensing God working in another area of their life? Let's be open to that, to the range of what God can be doing. This ministry, it will involve interruptions. It will involve setbacks. It will involve the unexpected. It did for Jesus, and it will for us too. Another thing that strikes me about this story is the whole question about the atmosphere that surrounds prayer. See, this story is not just about Jesus responding to a crisis. He wants to change the atmosphere around what's happening. As we read the story of the daughter that died, when he gets there and she's died, Jesus seems to be concerned about the atmosphere in which he's going to minister. Before he goes into the house, he surrounds himself with his close followers. He did not let anyone follow him, it says, except Peter, James, and John, as he stopped the others coming with him for some reason. He then removes other people that are going to be a distraction. There were those there that were wailing and they were crying, and it says he put them all out. In other words, he's bothered about what is going on around him. There's another story actually in Mark chapter 7, beginning at verse 31, where Jesus heals a man who can neither hear nor speak. And we're told they bring this man to Jesus and they beg Jesus to heal him. There's a lovely detail when it says he takes the man aside away from the crowd. Something about the crowd bothered him. Maybe they were talking too loudly, maybe they were staring, no space or whatever it was, but he deliberately takes the man away from there to a different setting. Now, I don't know what it's like in the place where you pray for the sick, maybe in church or wherever it is, but it's worth thinking about the atmosphere for a few moments. When you're with somebody, can you hear what they're saying? Maybe there's speakers right by you with music coming out of them. Maybe there's just too many people round about. Is there also enough privacy for the person to feel comfortable? Or do they think that everyone else is staring at them and they're just finding that uncomfortable? Is the person comfortable with you? Perhaps if you're a guy and there's a lady you're praying for, maybe she prefers to be with other ladies. What she's going to share is just too much to pray with a man. Let's be sensitive to that. And these are all good questions as we think about the setting for the ministry in which we're involved. This story about Jairus' daughter and this woman that interrupt him, it's such a powerful story. And I often wonder, in this, what was Jairus thinking? At the end of the day, I bet Jairus was thanking God from the bottom of his heart of what he'd seen Jesus do. But during the day, I guess he was just so confused at what was going on. This was getting worse. His daughter died. At the time, he must have been so full of confusion and questions. Well, in this ministry in which God has entrusted us, there will always be setbacks. There will be disappointments. God will not always work in the way that we think he ought to work. We won't always see the results that we want to see. But all around us there are people who are in such physical, emotional need. They need this ministry. And if we can catch this truth, that God has given us this ministry, that he can flow through us, whoever we are, however we're feeling, then I think we'll be open to the fact that we can be there for them and we can be there for God. And if we can do that, we will see glorious things happening.